And we have a kind of collective name for them. Plesiosaurs. Dimetrodon, the guy with the sail, that's a plesiosaur. So they kind of set the bottom end there, and it's not a well-defined group. And out of them, or somewhere along there, we get another lineage that heads towards what we're going to call modern mammals. And early ones are a group called therapsids. Now, and another color here. How about red? How do the evolutionary trends we see as we go from primitive synapsid on up, we see the jaw becoming stronger and simpler. We see the roof of the mouth closed up, so we have a separate passage for the air, separate passage for the food and water, right? We see mobility issues where the primitive ones have their limbs out here like this. More advanced things have their limbs in this. So mobility is increased, the jaw is strengthened. These are some of the trends. And these are therapsids. We don't have those anymore. And something like a therapsid or a therapsid gave rise to another group called cynodonts. And in cynodonts, again, we see the strengthening of the jaw. We see that, remember, called the secondary palate, the roof of your mouth closes up. We probably see hair showing up here. We probably see warm-bloodedness showing up here. Remember, hair and warm-bloodedness usually come together. And then again, something like a cynodon or cynodon gives rise to mammals. And the defining trait for mammals is right, milk. That kind of summarizes last time. And then we talked about different kinds of mammals, right? Okay. So anyway, that's just an overview. Where's my buttons here? So, we're pretty much focused on modern mammals now. Let's have a look. And this is just mammalogy. It's a class that we don't have on this campus. There are no even of those peripheral specialties, mammals. We had Dr. Cartwright, but she went to Miami. She worked with marine mammals. So just random things about mammals. We could do a whole class on this, like almost any of these groups. I just picked out some things to talk about. Mammalian integument. Integument, that's a word, you see, a biology word, and it means skin. But in kind of a complex way, that skin is an organ, a structural thing. Structure and function. And if we look at mammalian skin, and we could have put a slide up like this for any of the other groups we wanted to look at, but we'll do mammals. It's fairly complex. It's a fairly complex, and actually it qualifies as an organ, not just a tissue or group of cells. It's an organ, and it's your interface with the environment. And there's several layers there. There's a fair amount of complexity. And so we got, for example, in mammals, unique to us, we have fur or hair coming out of that. And associated with hair, we have glands that produce sweat or produce oils to maintain that hair and to maintain that surface. Our skin, I would say it's more, I would say it's more complex than reptile skin, but not a whole lot more. And if we look at it in cross-section, one of the aspects of mammalian skin is we don't have scales. We have hair. Reptiles have scales, birds have scales and feathers. We have hair, and we don't have the scales. So this is a cross-section through someone's mammalian skin. And the one point I want to make here is our outer layer, and we've talked about this, I think, in other contexts. Our outer layer is thick, and the word we use is cornified. No, I have to spell it. Cornified. The other word, which in American English has taken on a slightly other meaning, is horny. And what both those things refer to is keratin. Our skin is keratinized or cornified. And that's a waterproofing layer we have. And You look at the cross-section of the skin, that outer layer, 20-30 cells thick, is dead skin cells packed with keratin. So certainly hair is a unique feature of mammals. And I'll make this point again. We're amniotes, so I'll make this point differently than I did earlier. We're amniotes, and the amniote groups are reptiles and birds and mammals. So reptiles, think lizard. They have scales. Birds have scales, but some of those scales have been modified into feathers. Feathers are modified reptile scales. And then we don't have feathers, we have hair. And hair, modified scales. Now anyway, that's one of our defining traits, and as we've talked about before, hair almost certainly evolved as someone in here trended towards warm-bloodedness. And the hair is an insulator. You're going to start burning energy to raise your body temperature. Well, that's really expensive. So we want a coat to conserve that heat, and that's where hair probably comes from. And it's there's the histology again. It grows out of the dermis and the epidermis. We'll leave those details to an anatomy class. The word for a mammal's fur is pelage, a kind of a word you see at a fur store. But that's what we refer to it. And this is beaver pelage. And depending on what kind of animal you are, you have different thicknesses, different lengths, different densities of fur depending on your particular needs, particularly your niche. Beaver fur is extremely thick and extremely fine. And that's something we see in aquatic mammals. They're swimming around in cold water. This extremely thick, extremely fine fur traps a lot of air and acts as an insulator. The finest, thickest fur is sea otters, and they swim around in very cold oceans. Beavers are close second. And then think something like a pig. Can you picture the bristles of hair in the back of a pig? Not very thin at all. Not very fine at all. Let's make a point that popped out of my brain. You're welcome. Hair, like feathers, is molted. Remember we talked about feathers being molted? Well, hair can be molted too, and I just picked out an example of the American bison has a summer coat and a winter coat, and he molts from one to the other. So, for example, as summer turns into fall and winter, the coat gets a lot thicker because it's going to be a lot colder for a few months, and then when it warms up in the spring, big, shaggy, disgusting pieces of fur start falling off him as he molts into the summer condition. So he can change with the seasons. Another good example would be some of these animals that camouflage with their fur. The Arctic fox has a summer coat and a winter coat. Not only is the winter coat thicker than the summer coat, it's a different color. Look at this. Can you see the animals in these pictures? Fur serves as insulation, but we color it up. And it also serves sometimes as camouflage or crypsis. And if you've ever been hiking and come across a baby fawn, you see her right there? You usually don't see the fawn until it jumps up and runs away. And that's because you got so close to it that it had no other choice. But normally their biology is extremely well hidden, and they just stay really, really still. Can you see the tiger face? Think about mammal, while we're on here, and I think I need a slide for that when you're thinking about mammal fur. Think about birds, and then think about mammals. Bird feathers, mammal fur. There are many mammals with blue fur, or bright green fur, or yellow fur. There aren't they? Mammals are usually earth tones, browns and grays and reds. And we talked about that earlier, but mammals don't see in color. So having colorful patterns on their fur is not anything they would do. Birds see in color, so they court and they display colors. Mammals don't. They display other ways, but usually not with color. Can you picture any colorful mammal? There are a couple. Baboons. There's a few primates that have colors, like on their faces or on their butts. They get bright red or blue. They see in color, and they use it as a display, but most mammals don't. There's a skunk. Remember this term from ecology? Aposematic, that means warning coloration, aposematic coloration. Skunk's a good example, but he's not trying to hide. He's boldly powdered so that any potential predator recognizes that that's a dangerous animal I need to stay away from. So we see some mammals not hiding, but advertising their presence. And then signaling is a big deal with some mammals, and the lion's mane on males is a signal to other males and to females for functioning that way. So where there's patterns, there's often reasons for them. Types of specialized hairs, well, we can call these whiskers, right? But the technical word for those vibrissae, and I think you can guess the function. They expand out there, they're anchored around nerve endings, and when those whiskers are touched, signals are sent right into the brain there, in great sense. If you're working around at night, you know you brushed up against a narrow passageway or a rock or something, and you have vibrissae up here also. Help position yourself. And there's random modified types of hair. I picked out a few more here. One is quills. These are actually highly modified hairs, and this kind of modifications happen several different times. Hedgehogs and porcupines and things like that have the hair modified into nasty, pokey, protective structures. Ever seen a live porcupine in the wild? They're kind of goofy, stupid animals. They're rodents. But he walks around with this extremely, what's the word I want here? Daunting obstacle if some predator's trying to get to him. Doesn't have to be mobile, doesn't have to be particularly smart. I've walked right up to them. And what they do is they stick their head under anything they get under, like under a log or under some bushes, and then they just wave that tail around. And predators know to avoid them. There's not a lot of space to get at one and chow on it. They have huge, huge brown eyes that stare up at you and say, just leave me alone. And there you go. When I was looking for pictures of porcupines, I found a picture of a baby porcupine. I thought it was cute. Horns, antlers, etc. Different mammal groups have things on their faces. Let's look at that. Start with horns. A horn is a very specific thing. And it is, if you look at the skeleton, the skull, it's got a bony core, it's part of the skull, and then it's covered with a sheath, and that sheath is made of keratin. Horns are not shed. They don't drop off at a certain point in life. If they're damaged, they can be repaired. It's a bone. And it's hollow, and before we had plastics and things we could mold, that was a really useful container. People would collect those. I think the most familiar thing would be a powder horn. Old-fashioned muskets and things, you'd have that horn filled with gunpowder. So horns come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They're for defense. They're for display, male to display. They're for combat. They're for arguing and fighting amongst the males, for example. So we've touched upon this before. There's the mountain goats, and their male-to-male combat using those horns. In many species, and this is something I should have looked at before because mammals aren't my thing, but when horns are present, males and females can have horns. But I think there's some species where females don't, but I'd have to look that up. And there you go, I just think that's so cool. And I can remember being up in the Rockies, camping or backpacking, and you hear this echoing across the canyons. You're deep in the wilderness there, and it's just boom! Kind of a neat, wild sound. And I just think it gotta hurt. Antlers are different than horns. Different in construction, different in structure, but in many cases similar functions are ascribed to antlers. So antlers grow. They're not a bony sheath with keratin. It's bare bone when they're mature. And they are seasonal. They grow during breeding season and mating season, and then they're shed. Horns are never shed unless you cut a horn off. But these fall off on their own, and they have to be put back, have to grow back each year. And males have antlers, females don't, in this case here. So when you're looking at a mature, in this case of this buck here with his antlers, that's bare, dead bone that grew out of his head. And when you see it younger, when you see him a little earlier in the season, they're covered with what's called velvet. This is skin. And that's the tissue that's nourishing and building those antlers as they grow. And it's called velvet. And that's a young buck when you see him with his velvety antlers. It's pretty unpleasant as he goes to a mature. And this is seasonal. They do this every year.
Oh, God.
But at a certain point, the blood flow stops to the velvet, and it sloughs off. And you'll see them, when this is happening, it must itch or hurt, I don't know, but it seems to annoy them. You'll see them rubbing their antlers against trees and bushes trying to scrape this stuff off. And it's shedding the velvet. And then, what are they for? In this case, they show up in breeding season. They're mostly about male-to-male interactions. The males have got some bull elks here that come together, and they grapple with those things and determine who gets access to the females. I assume when they're there, they're also useful for defense, but the fact that they're not there year-round suggests that defense is a lesser concern for them. At the end of the season, the antlers are dropped off. So they don't seem to have much other function, and they're shed, and that's not just whatever happens there, the base gets sealed off, and off it drops. So it goes the rest of the year without that. So, antlers, just a sign here. If you are in part of the country where there's a lot of elk or deer, sometimes antlers are harvested. My daughter's dog had little pieces of deer antler that were used as a chew, and people used them in crafts and art. And attention antler hunters. Antler hunting and gathering is controlled, at least on federal and state lands in many cases. You might think, who cares if someone goes out and picks up the antlers? People actually shoot at each other over antler harvesting because there's some money involved sometimes. But actually, it is controlled for good biological reasons. I mean, it is a resource. Boy Scout troop I was in made seasonal money by going out and getting them and selling them. But when these things fall off, it's a large block of calcium and phosphorus that sits on the ground. And those are important nutrients in the food chain. And actually small mammals like mice and rabbits and actually larger mammals actually chew on those as a source for calcium. So if you strip a habitat of those antlers, you're basically exporting an important nutrient out of the habitat. So it's controlled for some reason. I'm not sure why it's always controlled in these lands. So I'm kind of, sometimes when I'm out hiking, if I see an antler, you'll see me step on it and break it up. And it's not because I'm being destructive, I'm just wanting it to stay there so someone gets to eat it. If it's all broken up, someone's not going to take it home, put it in their backyard. That's a little passive-aggressive, but that's what I do. Now there's a rhinoceros, and that we call that a horn, but it's one of the others. It's not an antler, it's not technically a horn. This horn, we're going to call it a horn, we don't have another word for it, I'm sure there's a technical word for it. There's no bony core to that. So it's not like a cow's horn or a ram's horn. It's actually densely packed keratin. So it's much lighter weight than a horn would be. So if you break that off, there's no bone there. You see the difference there? There's no sheath. It's not hollow. It's solid. And as you know, unfortunately, certain cultures have decided that rhino horn, when you grind them up, it accentuates your sex life or something. So one of the reasons the different species of rhinoceros are critically endangered, and we may lose some of them in the next 10, 15 years, poaching for those horns. Nowadays, where rhinos are in the wild, there aren't very many rhinos in an unmanaged wild condition, even in Africa anymore. Where they're in managed conditions, like in national parks in Africa, actually they capture them, they saw their horns off, and then release them. And the idea is if it doesn't have a horn, the poacher won't shoot him. So it's kind of sad that we've gotten to that point, but that's where we're at. Some guy showed up in the Antiques Roadshow a while back, that show, the Antiques Roadshow, and he had a table full of carved rhino horn, like little dishes and bowls and things. And I was kind of disappointed that the antique guy analyzing it didn't point out the cost of that. These were all antique, so they weren't. But if you're caught in the possession of rhino horn stuff today, coming into the country, you'll face serious fines and jail time. But the antique stuff is not controlled. We're off topic. Nails, claws, and hooves, the stuff on the feet. These are also made of keratin. These are keratinized structures. And again, different animals, different mammals have different structures for different functions. Gripping and tearing. Claws, like on your cat or your dog. Nails are a primate thing mostly, and I've struggled to figure out, maybe a little learning, what nails are about. And I think part of it is it protects the tip of your finger, but it's not a claw, so it doesn't get in the way. So, you're about manipulating things with the tips of your fingers, not with your claws. And then these are some specialized walking around hooves, walking around foot endings. Foot endings, that's what we'll call them. And then here's an example of just a weird one. A little African and Asian creature. There's about 5 or 6 species of these. They're called pangolins. And these little plates are packed keratin. Can you think of a North American, I just thought I can put a slide in. Can you think of a North American mammal with keratinaceous plates all over it?
Armadillo.
Did I hear it?
The armadillo.
Armadillo, yeah. Armadillo. There's no line. That's, I get never do that. Pangolins are little rainforest creatures from, we're on them, Africa and Asia. Little insectivores, eat termites and ants and things. And I found a picture of a baby. There's the mom, and the babies grip on the mom's tail and get carried around. You see them at zoos occasionally. Anything in rainforest creatures probably endangered. Not a lot of mammals have scales. We see scales in birds and reptiles. We presumably saw scales. Well, we see scales down here in these primitive synapsids. But mammals, for the most part, have lost scales, and they show up in a few places, and the best place I could find any is, for example, on the tail of a rat, or some rodents have scaly tails. I know that picture, it's hard not to like rats if you look at that picture. Say, don't trap me. And then other random places where you see keratin. This is one of the great whales. We should do a day on the whales. We used to do it after Cartwright left, so we don't do whales anymore. I need to work on that. The great whales, filter feed. And these are plates of keratin. It's a word that we should get in our vocabulary. And now I have to spell it. I think that's correct. Baleen, does that look right? These hang down from the roof of the mouth, and they get frayed along the bottom, and whales, the great whales, baleen whales, take a mouthful of seawater and then push it out, and they filter feed. So let's think of the ecology of this. These are the largest animals in the ocean, and they're feeding down on the bottom of the food chain. That makes sense, right? The lower you go in the food chain, the more there is. And the biggest things feed at that bottom level. So anyway, keratin and skin. Mammals, in their skin, we have glands. We have sweat glands, and we have these things called sebaceous glands. I'm going to leave the details of these to an anatomy class. We have a rich glandular life in our skin. And again, remember that mammals evolved at night. Early mammals were nocturnal, so vision was not our key sense. Hearing was our key sense, and smelling was our key sense. Mammals are much more attuned to smell than other groups, certainly birds and a lot of reptiles. We do a lot with smells. As human primates, we do less than other mammals, but it's still a big deal for us. So these are scents. And mammals, I'm trying to think of examples of other vertebrates that do this, and I can't. Just don't mark with scents. Certainly, I can't think that reptiles do. They might, but not as extensively. But mammals do an awful lot of scent marking. And you've watched your cat rub her chin on things, and you think she's come home and she rubs her chin on you, and you think, oh, sweet, she missed me. She's actually marking you. So the other cats know this is my human. And, scent marking with urine, and actually near the back end of a lot of mammals, there's scent glands. And when they urinate, they spray these scents out too. And bears, if you're out in the country, you might see a tree, and about your chest height, all the bark is torn off. And bears do that. They come by there and they tear it up, and they have scent glands in their paws. And they'll leave their scent there, and other bears coming through, these are like marker posts, and they'll walk through, okay, Jack is back. So we do a lot of marking with that. We do communicating with scents in a way that I'm trying to think of other vertebrate examples, and I can't, that other vertebrates tend not to. My point popped out of my brain. We don't like scents as humans, at least in certain of our human cultures, and we mask them. And we are culturally conditioned to think that these are pretty unpleasant when you're around a sweaty, unwashed person, and you spend a lot of money disguising these scents. And there's a good job there, working at a deodorant research factory. That's a real job, by the way. There are people out there, most of us don't have really acute senses of smell. Some of us more than others, I'm sure. But there are a few people out there that have incredibly fine discrimination when it comes to smells. And those people make a ton of money. They work for perfume factories. I mean, they can distinguish, where you might distinguish 20 different smells, they can distinguish 100, on a scale like a rainbow. They work for perfume companies. They work for NASA. The space program hires smell people, because you're trapped up there in space with a limited amount of air. Smells become an issue. Not just human smells, but other smells. And there's apparently one of the early Soviet space missions was brought back early because it smelled so bad in the capsule. They didn't control for that. So just an interesting sideline there. So the key mammal thing is mammary glands. That's the main synapomorphy that we use to define the class Mammalia, is mammary glands. So we make milk to feed our offspring. And the mammary glands are derived from these things called sebaceous glands. Against a little bit of an anatomy, I'm going to leave that details to the anatomy class, but these are modified skin glands that produce this nutrient-rich material, which we call milk. So remember our mammal diversity, 3 kinds of mammals: monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. The primitive mammals, monotremes, these are baby monotremes, a baby platypus and a baby echidna. Monotremes don't have nipples. The mama monotreme, she has the milk glands all over her breast, and the milk oozes out into the fur, and the little guys suckle the milk out of the fur. So we're making milk. That's not what you think of. Not as complicated. The next step up is marsupials. Marsupial mammals, the milk glands are associated with nipples, and the baby gets the milk directly from the nipple. Look at that little embryonic, whatever that is, I don't know what to say, but forelimbs are barely developed. Remember we talked about monotremes? They're born as embryos. Look, the face is hardly developed, no eye, no ears, no hind legs even yet. This thing does it, what we call its embryology, does it inside the pouch instead of inside the mother. And that's a joey, a little baby, a big baby kangaroo feeding. And then placental mammals take this a step farther with well-developed nipples and mammary glands associated with them. And there's just a fair amount of variation here. In dolphins, they're towards the back end there. I think I had a picture of manatees, and manatees, they're in the flipper pits. And A lot of normal mammals, regular mammals are kind of where you expect to find them on the front of the female. All right. Now, like I said, just random things. We can talk about any of these groups we covered. We could talk about these things with them. But I just thought we'd look at food and feeding for a bit and use it as to explore how mammals are put together. But again, these could be applied to fishes, birds, whatever. So mammals have pretty wide feeding niches. If there's a food resource out there, there's a mammal with the tools to utilize that resource. Highly specialized filter feeder to a highly generalized omnivore, where omnivore means eats plant and animal matter. And you see often, like I said, fairly generalized creatures. Anything I can put in my mouth, I'm going to eat. To fairly specialized mammalian feeding. Fairly specialized carnivore. A super specialized insectivore. This guy's not going to eat frogs and mice. This guy's going to eat flying insects. There's an anteater that eats termites and ants. That's not going to be very good at eating apples or again, mice or something like that. And there's a highly specialized worm finder, a mole. So, lots of variation on the theme. Here's a neat example. The panda bear is a super specialized bamboo eater. Bamboo, that thick grass. And look at his hand to his head, how he eats it. He kind of pulls it along through his mouth and strips off the finer leaves and then throws the cane away. But look at the tool he has. He's a bear. So he's got a paw like a bear does, but he needs to be able to grab that cane and pull it back and forth. Now you can do that because you have a thumb, right? Bears don't have thumbs. Look at his paw here. Here's his fingers. Here, one pad for each finger. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's his fingers. And that's his thumb right there. And he's got this extra thing here. He's got a growth on one of his wrist bones that's got a pad on it, and that's his grip. He kind of does it like this without the thumb. So, very specialized structure for doing a very specific thing. But most mammals interact with their food through their teeth, and teeth give you a window into the biology of the diet, whether it's a fossil thing or a living thing. And mammalogists, when I've worked with them or I've worked in collections, museum collections, working, curating mammals, the jaws and the skull and the teeth are extremely important in mammal identification. When you're running a key for mammals, we had our little mouse skulls out in our outpell lab. If we ran those through keys, the key would eventually get to a point where you count the number of molars or premolars or the position of the canine teeth. The teeth are really important for understanding mammalian diversity. I think that's partly because they're so obvious, and any mammal specimen you have, you can see them. So remember, with regard to teeth, there's different conditions. And there's a primitive synapsid, and that's the primitive amniote condition. Primitive vertebrate condition is homodont teeth, and that means all the teeth are pretty much the same. You don't have a lot of tooth specialization. Homodont, same tooth. And again, I erased part of it. As we move up our evolutionary tree towards mammals, we start to see heterodont condition, where we see, for example, first we see canine teeth, and the rest of teeth are kind of the same, but we start to see differentiation in teeth. Until we get to modern mammals with the full heterodont condition there, and you have different kinds of teeth, canine teeth, incisors, molars, and premolars. Different teeth in different parts of the mouth for different functions, and that's a mammalian trait. So the incisors are the teeth up front. In something like a rodent, this is a rodent of some sort, they're hyperdeveloped and they're for chipping and tearing things off. And something like this carnivore here, they're kind of much smaller, not particularly, probably not particularly important in most of what he does. Canines, we call them canines, but they pretty much occur across mammals, are the large distinctive teeth on the upper and lower jaw. least in the carnivores, like this lion that shows them so beautifully. Those are about, you're eating other mammals for the most part, and you grab it, and those get a really firm grip. They sink deep into the flesh, and they generate fatal wounds. The animal bleeds to death from those. And even if it staggers away, it's not going to go very far for subduing an injury. Molars and premolars, these are food processing teeth, and they can be for slicing and cutting. They can be for grinding and crushing, depending on what your diet is. So here's some tooth specializations. It's always variation on the theme. This is the underside of a walrus skull. The canines are developed in these huge tusks, which are about display, and I think about dragging themselves up on ice out of the water. But there's the molars and premolars. What do you think? What do you know what walruses eat?
Bottoms.
They pick things up at the bottom, but what are they picking up off the bottom?
Clams.
Yeah, shellfish. These are for crushing clams. Here's an insectivore, like a mole. Lots of tiny, really, really sharp teeth, like needles. These guys are eating worms, or they're eating arthropods, things with exoskeletons. So they punch a whole bunch of holes in that exoskeleton when they bite it. And then they can hold on to it. There's a pangolin skull there, and I couldn't find a better picture to show you the skull there. They don't have teeth. They're termite specialists, which are soft-bodied, gooey insects. They gum them, and then back they go. And armadillos are, again, ant and termite specialists. These are little crushing teeth. They're hardly present there, but he's eating small insects for a living. Grubs, soft-bodied things. And we've come up against dolphin skulls a bunch of times. This long beak filled with really, really sharp teeth. That's a fish-catching tool. Whenever you see that, it's like an alligator or an ichthyosaur, long beak with lots of sharp teeth. That, you're grabbing a fish, that's all muscle. You're just grabbing a big piece of flopping muscle. That gives you a good grip on it and inflicts a lot of injury. A lot of mammals, we don't have them as primates, but have this space between the incisors. Like this is a deer or an elk or something like that, or a cow. You see the incisors up here, and you see this space here. It's called the diastema. And this is a specialized herbivore. He clips vegetation up here, and then passes it back and grinds it in here. If you watch cows in the field, chewing, and when you're eating low-quality food, it's a lot of work to get it digested. Oh, it's a deer. Yeah, I've mentioned the elephant before, and I meant to look this up before I came in so I'd give you the right number, but elephants have, if I remember correctly, it's 7 teeth. And they're very unusual teeth. This is it. This is one tooth, and there it is in the mouth, and there are 7 more behind it, or 6 more behind it. And as this wears out, and elephants are grinding up vegetation, that's a grinding structure. As this tooth wears out, the one behind it pushes forward. And this worn out tooth is shed. And it's either 6 or 7, I can't remember the exact number, but 6 or 7. An elephant lives, if it doesn't die for other reasons, it starves to death at the end of its life, because it gets to the end of its last row of teeth, and then it can't eat anymore when those teeth are worn out. So it gets, and that takes about 10 years a set. So they live 60, 70 years. Kind of an example, not kind of, an example of convergence, 2 different things with similar structures. This is a beaver, which is a rodent. This is a rabbit. A lot of people think rabbits are rodents. They're not. They're actually a step down from rodents. They're more primitive than rodents, but very similar food-getting structure, and probably convergent. They probably came upon that set of teeth, the big canines and the grinding structure independently because they're eating the same things. Yeah?
What class of rabbits are they?
They're called lagomorphs, Lagomorpha. So, that's another example of something weird. And we talked about dolphins a minute ago, but they have reacquired homodont dentition. And, mammals went to all this bother to evolve different types of teeth, and dolphins said, we'll go with the alligator kind of teeth. So, lots of interesting stuff there. We had more time in the more specific mammal class we could walk through. I thought this was kind of a neat kind of summary of mammal evolution based on diet and skull patterns. You can run your finger around that if you're interested. And then these are specialized teeth, usually in the form of tusks. These are teeth, actually. And unfortunate for the animals that have them because they are often sought as, ivory. This is elephant ivory, walrus ivory. That's a modified tooth there.
Is that a narwhal?
That's a narwhal, yeah. With one tooth in his head. So anyway, dietary niche. Again, just form and function when we're looking at diet here. So, common mammal niches. Insectivore, and that's a shrew. Small, little insectivorous mammal, worms and insects. When I lived in Ohio, I told you there's a big backyard with a stream and forest behind it. And somehow a family of shrews got into our garage. And one of the cats used to go out there. And she caught a shrew one day. And thought that was a one-off thing. And she went out there the next day and brought back another shrew. And then for months, she'd just sit by the door. We didn't let her in the garage after that because we didn't want her catching our shrews. But she just sat by the door and complained that we weren't letting her in the garage go shrew hunting. These other examples of insectivores. There's a mole, and look at the digging machinery this mole has. He spends most of his life underground, burrowing right under the surface, and his face is all spread out here with sensory structures for worms and grubs, and there's little teeth for subduing a mosquito. And again, insectivores often a lot of really sharp, small teeth. You can, if you have soft anatomy of anything, the intestine, and we did this with fishes, the intestine will give you an idea of what they're eating, or some ideas. And example, an insectivore intestine, well, they're eating meat. You know, insects are essentially meat, they're carnivores. And an insectivorous intestine usually is relatively short, because that's easy stuff to digest. We don't need any complex machinery. We just take a normal intestine. The stomach kind of churns and meshes it up, and then we break it down the intestine. We don't need a really long intestine to do that. A cecum would be like your appendix, a little pocket off to the side. It's a digestive aid, and you don't need that if you're eating insects. Let's have a look at herbivores. That's a moose, and apparently if you're in Europe, that's an elk. And what we call a moose, they call an elk. But we call that a moose on our side of the ocean. And if you look at herbivores, there's a bunny and a deer. We just did this. You have a grinding mill back here. That lower jaw is like that lower plate in one of those things that the Pueblo Native Americans ground their corn with. It's a big, sturdy thing. And the teeth are robust. They're not sharp. They've got grinding surfaces on them. So that jaw moves like this, forward and back and forth. It also sometimes moves side to side, like in circular motion. So they're crushing that. Snipping and then crushing. And an intestine for digesting plant matter is going to be different. Plant matter is a lot of junk in plant matter. We call it fiber. And you're supposed to eat it, but you can't digest it. And so the intestine for an herbivore is usually very long. It just takes a lot of processing to get what you're going to get out of that. And many herbivores have a cecum. And a cecum, look at this, it's a blind sac coming off the intestine. And food matter will be shunted in there, and it's allowed to ferment. It sits there for a while. There's bacteria and maybe fungus in there, maybe protists in there, and they break it down. And then they get flushed into the rest of the intestine, and then they get digested. But it's called a fermentation chamber. It's a digestive. We don't have that as higher primates. And we have that little thing called the appendix. It's probably a remnant of a cecum. And some herbivores have up front these set of chambers for processing the food. A similar thing. They chew it up, it ferments with the help of bacteria and fungus, and then they send it in the intestine. So they might have an up front system here. Deer have this, cows have this. You know, you heard cows have 4 stomachs? Not not 4 stomachs, it's 4 chambers. And they also have a cecum back here for further processing. Yeah, up front it's called a rumen, and we will leave the details of that to other classes. Finally, we got carnivores in the strict, so not insectivores, but carnivores, and are eating other vertebrates, I suppose we should say. The tools for acquiring the food are often fairly elaborate and kind of scary looking, because, well, they're scary looking because you're a potential prey of something like this. You're not this bat doesn't scare you because bat can't eat you. This thing can. So the tools are for subduing and killing a struggling prey animal, and then dismantling it. And there you go. Next, the gals. Know much about lion biology? African lions are delightful. The ladies do nearly all the hunting, and when they kill something, the guy wakes up and staggers down and eats, and if there's anything left, they get to eat. Not an equal system. You know what male lions do all day?
Sleep.
23 hours a day.
Jeez.
23 hours a day. So anyway, I thought this was a neat picture. The zebras have spotted her. And they form a defensive line. So a carnivorous intestine. Again, like the insectivore intestine, it's typically not super long. Meat is fairly easy to digest. And the cecum, if present, is so small it's hardly functional. There's maybe a little bit of function going on in there, but not much. Your appendix, and some of you probably had your appendix removed, possibly, so you're doing with that. You can live without it. And then there's omnivores, and omnivores are, a lot of mammals eat anything they can put in their mouth, and they would have an intestine kind of, I would say more like a carnivore's intestine than an herbivore's intestine. Examples of omnivores would be a lot of primates, pigs, and a classic example of a local thing would be a raccoon. It's a South American thing. Look, got a set of nice carnivorous teeth, and then some nice grinding, crushing teeth, but they're kind of like you. I mean, you don't have well-developed canines as a human primate. Your teeth kind of functional. Not extremely well at any one of these types of diets, but work reasonably well at any of them. There's random food things. You see these occasionally when you're out hiking. You're looking around. Some animals cache food. And you should be very careful about that, because that little guy or gal may have spent all summer putting that away, and she needs it for the winter. When you see things like that, you need to make sure you don't disturb them. Well, I don't do much physiology because that's not my background, but I thought we'd do just a real quick amount here and talk about metabolism. Mammals are warm-blooded, and let's focus on that for a second. And what that means, what warm-blooded means in an energetic context is you need to take in a lot of energy just to maintain your body temperature. And I've used this example before. If you have a pet snake, you feed it 2 or 3 times a month. You have a dog, you feed it 1 or 2 times a day. That's just the difference in food intake. And most, as a warm-blooded animal, most of our intake is just to maintain that energy. So heat loss becomes an issue. And there's an important factor in anything that's you're trying to conserve something, or you're trying to conserve something like heat. The surface to volume ratio becomes important. The higher the surface to volume ratio, in other words, the higher the surface area per volume, the easier it is to conserve something. Something small like this doesn't have a lot of mass and has a lot of surface area per volume. And if you think the volume is, the heat is conserved in the volume, the fluids, and the heat radiates out the surface area. Here, we've got much less surface area per volume, but we can conserve our heat there. So there's an issue there. And we have mammals in size from huge to very small. An animal, medium-sized mammal, or a really large one, has a much higher volume to surface ratio. That's it. I had it reversed a second ago. He's losing a lot less heat through his skin than something like this is. This is a little shrew. And look how size he's on. It's still on your thumb. That's an adult. That's the smallest North American mammal. It's called a pygmy shrew. This little guy has to eat all day long and all night long. He has to eat constantly in order to maintain a body temperature because he just loses so much heat through his skin. Elephant, well, has to eat a lot because he's an herbivore, but doesn't have nearly the same problem. So something small like this, if it ends up in a situation like trapped in a garage, like ours were, or falls into a hole and can't get out and can't find food, they tend to go into, the word is torpor. They tend to go into they lose their body temperature and they get slower and slower and slower and eventually die. But I picked up hummingbirds. Hummingbirds have the same problem. They're so small. And if a hummingbird flies into your garage, or we had a place at Arizona State where I was where there was a breezeway and the hummingbirds would fly in there, get trapped, and they couldn't find their way back out. If they're there for more than half a day without eating, you'd find them on the ground. They weren't dead yet. You had to, I used to walk by there because I routed by there every day to make sure there weren't any hummingbirds in there. But you'd pick it up and you'd warm it up. Then I'd go up to where the factory got coffee and I'd get some sugar. And I'd make a little cup of sugar water and give it to her, and off she'd go. Off topic. And if you look at metabolism, and you can measure it, they measured here the amount of oxygen consumed per hour. That's a measure of your metabolism, how much you're burning. And just look at that shrew as an example, an incredibly small mammal, really high metabolism. He's burning a lot of energy. And you go down here, bigger and bigger animals, so you get to humans and horses and elephants, and our metabolism is a lot slower. If you had metabolism like this, you could do that for a couple of days, you'd lose a lot of weight. So anyway, where are we going? Did that. All right, let's take a minute here, a couple minutes here. Relax for a second, put your pencils down. But just a few more mammal things, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Professor?
Yeah.
Did you say horns are for male and female species?
I think usually males and females have horns. I think there's some things where females don't have horns.
And then antlers is male only?
Males is antlers only. They're, you know what? I just thought of an exception. Female reindeers have antlers, I think. I think
So
generally, I think there's exceptions to both.